It started as one of those humid Kentucky nights where the air feels heavy enough to hold memories. The town of Pine Valley sat quiet below, its porch lights flickering against the tree line, while 5 friends made their way up the old dirt road toward Miller's Bluff. It was July of 2001, the summer before everything was supposed to change. Evan Brooks was the one who planned it. He'd been talking for weeks about one last night, the kind you never forget, a bonfire, music, a few beers, and the comfort of knowing that for a few more hours, they were still just kids. Melissa Carter and Hannah Reed rode in the back seat, singing along to the radio as Jake Myers teased them from the passenger side. Travis Lorne drove. He was the oldest of the group, the one everyone trusted behind the wheel, even when the road narrowed and curved dangerously near the edge of the bluff. Miller's Bluff wasn't on any official map. It was a clearing at the end of a forgotten logging trail, a place locals whispered about but used anyway. From up there, you could see the entire valley, the reservoir glinting like black glass under the moonlight. Teenagers had been sneaking up there for decades, but that night, it felt different. A few of the kids from town said later they remembered hearing that old Ford Ranger grinding up the hill around 10:30. The sound faded, replaced by the faint echo of music somewhere deep in the woods. By 11, the fire was roaring. They sat in a loose circle, bottles half empty, laughter cutting through the trees. Melissa had brought a disposable camera and kept snapping photos. Evan making a peace sign, Hannah roasting a marshmallow, Jake leaning back, staring up at the stars. In those photos, they looked happy, carefree, and yet, if you look closely, you can see that strange stillness in the background. No bugs, no night sounds. Just the glow of the flames reflecting in 5 pairs of young, uncertain eyes. Sometime around midnight, the wind shifted. Evan's brother, who lived 2 miles down in the valley, would later tell police he heard an engine rev, then stall. Another neighbor said she thought she heard a scream carried on the wind, faint, but sharp enough to make her turn off her porch light and listen. The sound came once, maybe twice, then was gone. Up at the bluff, the music had stopped. The last photos on Melissa's camera were taken at 11:52 p.m. One of them shows her standing near the edge, her face half lit by the fire. Behind her, in the shadows, 2 small points of light glint through the trees like distant headlights. Investigators would later magnify that image dozens of times, but they never found out what those lights really were. Around 12:15 a.m., a faint echo rippled through the hills, metal against stone, then silence. People in town brushed it off as thunder. But when morning came, the 5 friends didn't come home. By sunrise, their parents were calling each other in, a quiet panic. Evan's truck wasn't in the driveway. Melissa's bed was still made. Hannah's phone went straight to voicemail. The sheriff's office was notified by 9 a.m., and deputies drove up the Old Ridge Road, expecting to find the group hungover, maybe asleep in the cab of that Ford Ranger. Instead, they found only the remnants of the fire-charred logs, a few crushed cans, tire tracks leading toward the bluff's edge, and nothing else. The ground was scorched in a strange pattern, like something had burned hotter and faster than wood. Near the ashes, someone had dropped a half-melted flip-flop. Farther down, officers found a torn flannel shirt caught in the brush, but there were no footprints leading away, no signs of struggle, just the emptiness of a summer night that had gone terribly wrong. That first day blurred into the next. Volunteers flooded the area, calling their names, searching the reservoir and woods with flashlights. The only sound that answered back was the steady hum of cicadas. Search dogs caught faint scents that vanished near the ridge. Helicopters combed the tree line. And yet, after 3 days, not a single trace of the 5 had been found. As the sun set on that 3rd day, Sheriff Dale Whitaker stood on the bluff and stared down at the valley below. The air smelled like rain and ash. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled again. He later said he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, not gone, just waiting to be found. But as the hours turned to days, and the days into weeks, that hope began to rot into fear. What began as a simple missing persons call was starting to feel like something else entirely, something no one in Pine Valley could explain. And somewhere, beneath the layers of mud and time, The truth was already waiting, hidden just beyond the firelight of that final summer night. By sunrise, Miller's Bluff no longer felt like the secret place it once was. The dirt road that only a few teenagers knew about was now lined with county trucks, news vans, and volunteers with orange vests. Sheriff Dale Whitaker stood near the clearing, arms crossed, scanning the charred remains of the bonfire from the night before. It didn't look like a crime scene yet, just the aftermath of a summer gathering that had gone wrong. But the silence told a different story. The parents had gathered at the base of the hill, pacing, calling names that no one answered. It was supposed to be a simple search. Maybe the kids had driven off somewhere. Maybe they'd gotten lost or run out of gas. But when deputies reached the edge of the bluff, the first thing they noticed were the tire marks, fresh, deep, and leading dangerously close to where the ground gave way into darkness. The prints ended abruptly. The soil crumbled where the slope dropped into the ravine. Deputy Colton Reeves leaned over the edge, shining his flashlight into the trees below. Nothing. No glint of metal, no broken branches, no sign of an accident. Just the sound of the wind moving through the valley. A few feet away, they found scattered beer cans, a cooler tipped over, and a burned patch of dirt where the fire had been. A melted plastic radio speaker was fused into the soil. But there were no phones, no wallets, no personal belongings left behind. By mid-morning, the sheriff called in additional units. ATVs arrived to push deeper into the surrounding woods. Search dogs were brought in from Lexington. Within hours, the Quiet Ridge became the center of one of the largest missing persons operations in county history. The reservoir below was sealed off as divers entered the cold, murky water. From above, a helicopter circled, scanning the tree line for any sign of that green Ford Ranger. The first day turned into 2, then 5. The water team swept every section of the reservoir, dragging sonar and magnets through the silt. Nothing came up except a few rusted fishing lines and an old bicycle frame. The sheriff's department expanded the search radius to include neighboring counties. Hundreds of flyers were printed, stapled to telephone poles, pinned to grocery store boards, taped to gas pumps. The local news ran it as a headline, 5 friends vanish after late-night bonfire. The story hit every station from Louisville to Knoxville. Within days, reporters swarmed Pine Valley, broadcasting from outside the sheriff's office, interviewing neighbors and classmates who barely knew the missing kids. People started coming out of the woodwork with theories, some heartfelt, others bizarre. A hunter claimed he'd seen strange lights near the ridge the night before. Someone else said they heard what sounded like 2 cars racing up the logging trail. Another man swore it was a bear attack, though no animal prints were ever found. Then the darker rumors began. Whispers about a drug deal gone bad. Talk of a cult living off the grid near the old quarry. It spread fast, fueled by fear, small-town gossip, and the emptiness of not having answers. The families, once close, began to turn on each other. Melissa's father accused Travis's cousin of withholding information. Hannah's mother refused to speak to Evan's parents after a rumor implied her daughter had planned to run away. The town, once bound by its church picnics and high school games, fractured overnight. By late August, the sheriff's department brought in state investigators. The Kentucky State Police analyzed soil samples from the bluff, tested every scrap of material, and sent burned debris to the crime lab. Weeks later, a report came back, trace evidence of gasoline residue near the fire pit, suggesting an accelerant had been used, but the cause was inconclusive. It could have been spilled fuel. It could have been something worse. Then came the first real clue. In early September, a volunteer found something half buried beneath the dirt, about 40 yards from the edge, a melted cell phone. Its casing was warped, battery split open from heat exposure. The model matched the one Melissa Carter's parents said she carried that summer. The serial number was still barely visible. It was hers. The phone was sent to the lab in Frankfurt. For weeks, technicians tried to pull data from the damaged drive. When the results finally came back, there was almost nothing, just one partially recovered image from the night of the bonfire. Investigators enlarged it, pixel by pixel. It showed a fire in the center, the silhouettes of 3 figures standing near it, and in the far background, the faint reflection of 2 bright orbs. They appeared to be headlights. But what bothered them wasn't what the lights showed, it was their position. They were too high off the ground to belong to another truck on the ridge. They seemed to be floating at an angle, half hidden behind the trees. Some swore it was just a lens flare from the disposable camera. Others weren't so sure. The discovery reignited the town's obsession. Radio hosts speculated nightly. The Pine Valley Five, as they were called, became a regional legend. People drove to the Bluff to see where it happened. Teenagers dared each other to spend the night there. The families pleaded for privacy, but the story took on a life of its own. By the end of that year, the official investigation had slowed to a crawl. Every lead had gone cold. No new evidence. No witnesses. Even the dive team admitted defeat. The reservoir was simply too deep, too murky to keep searching indefinitely. The sheriff ordered the site sealed off, though people still sneaked in after dark. Christmas came and went. 5 empty chairs, 5 stockings left hanging out of habit. The school year began again, and the friends' names were printed in the yearbook with a single line beneath. Gone, but not forgotten. But the truth was, they were being forgotten. Slowly, painfully, like a scar fading over time. By the 2nd anniversary, attendance at the memorial vigil had dropped in half. The flyers had yellowed, rain-streaked, torn from poles. Life crept back to normal on the surface, at least. People in town went back to work, back to Sunday service, back to pretending they weren't haunted by what happened on that bluff. Still, every once in a while, someone would claim to hear things out there. Strange sounds at night, the echo of an engine that no one could find. Sometimes, drivers said their headlights would flicker for no reason when passing the reservoir road. For the sheriff, those calls never stopped. Every time the phone rang, every time a tip came in, he hoped it would be the one, the breakthrough. But by 2003, the Pine Valley Five were officially declared missing, presumed dead. The case file closed, but the story didn't. Not for the families who still left porch lights on at night, or for the sheriff who drove out to Miller's Bluff every year on the same date. Standing in silence where the fire once burned, no one could explain why it felt colder up there, why the air always smelled faintly of smoke, and though life moved on, Pine Valley never really did. By 2018, 17 long years had passed since the night the Pine Valley Five disappeared. Most people had stopped talking about it out loud, but in quiet corners of the town, the grocery store, the post office, the church steps after Sunday service, the story still lived, whispered in fragments. Some said the kids must have driven off the bluff by accident. Others believed they ran away, chasing a life that Pine Valley could never offer. A few still thought it was something darker. But by then, the mystery had faded into something else entirely. A collective ache that the town had learned to live with. Every July, the families gathered at the ridge for a vigil. They'd light candles in a row along the dirt road, say a prayer, and stare out over the reservoir that had swallowed their hope all those years ago. Parents grew older. Children who hadn't even been born yet grew up hearing about the 5 names carved into a memorial stone. Evan, Melissa, Jake, Hannah, Travis. No bodies, no truck, no closure. Just a story that ended too early. Sheriff Whitaker had retired years ago. The case files sat boxed up in the evidence room, their edges yellowed, the ink fading. The world had moved on. New houses were built, new families moved in. But Miller's Bluff never changed. Locals still said there was something about that ridge, the way fog lingered there longer than anywhere else. How car engines sometimes stalled near the bend. People avoided it after dark. Even the rangers patrolling the area said the place felt wrong. That's how it was when Ranger Abigail Lowe came across it in the spring of 2018. She was 31, new to the district, assigned to monitor fire hazards after a string of late-season lightning strikes. Her patrol route took her deep into the backcountry, farther than most hikers ever went. A storm 2 nights earlier had washed out part of an old road, a path she didn't recognize from any recent maps. She almost turned back, but something about it caught her attention. The trees on either side leaned inward unnaturally, and the mud looked disturbed, like something heavy had shifted beneath it. When she stepped closer, she saw a sliver of metal glinting through the mud. At first, she thought it was debris, maybe a piece of farming equipment from decades ago. But when she knelt down, brushing away the soil, her fingers touched curved steel, a door handle. Her breath caught. There shouldn't have been a vehicle this far down the ridge. The nearest road had been closed since 2003. She radioed it in, her voice steady but trembling underneath. Within an hour, county deputies arrived. Excavation crews were called by dusk. The dig was slow, deliberate, and the deeper they went, the stranger it became. What emerged from the earth wasn't just a vehicle. It was the vehicle, the missing Ford Ranger. 17 years of rust and rock had pressed it into the ravine wall, flattening it like paper. The impact must have been brutal. When they opened the cab, the air was thick with the smell of earth and something else: burnt fabric, oil, decay. Inside were 3 skeletal remains, fused to the seats by years of compression and mud. A melted stereo sat half submerged in the floorboard. Shards of glass still clung to the frame where the windshield should have been. They found a watch stopped at 12:19. A bracelet, a single white sneaker wedged between the seats. News spread through Pine Valley before nightfall. For 17 years, families had waited for answers. Now they had something tangible, but not the closure they'd imagined. Reporters returned. Helicopters hovered above the site again, just like they had in 2001. But the tone was different this time. Somber, careful. The town, once obsessed with theories, now watched in quiet disbelief. The coroner's office transported the remains to Frankfurt for testing. Forensic analysts worked day and night. DNA confirmed what everyone already feared. Evan Brooks, Hannah Reed, and Travis Lorne had been found. But 2 names, Melissa Carter and Jake Myers, were still unaccounted for. What puzzled investigators wasn't just who was missing. It was how the truck ended up there. The slope of the ravine suggested it had rolled backward off the bluff, tumbling nearly 30 feet before smashing into the stone. But there were inconsistencies. The keys weren't in the ignition. All 3 seatbelts were still latched, and the driver's side door was locked from the inside. If they'd been wearing their seatbelts when it went over, they would have been trapped instantly. There were no signs anyone had tried to escape, yet the front passenger window had been rolled halfway down. Mud had filled the space like plaster, but inside, the surface of the dashboard was cleaner, as if someone had wiped it after the crash. Investigators traced the scene, inch by inch. They recovered fragments of burned cloth, a melted flashlight, and a rusted lighter with initials etched faintly into the casing: H.R. Hannah Reed. Beneath the driver's seat, they found a compact camera, the same model Melissa was known to carry that summer. The film inside had long been destroyed by moisture, but the sight of it reignited old wounds. The families gathered at the sheriff's office when the news was confirmed. The scene inside was heavy, almost reverent. Evan's father held a folded map of the bluff that he'd carried every year to each vigil, the edges worn soft. Hannah's mother sat in silence, her hands trembling as she whispered, "At least we can bring them home." But closure wasn't simple. 2 of their children were still missing, and the evidence didn't fit neatly into the idea of an accident. The path Ranger Lowe discovered had been sealed off, long before 2001. For their truck to end up there, someone would have had to cut through the barrier or approach from the other side of the ridge, a route only loggers and surveyors would have known about. The local paper ran headlines for weeks: "Partial remains of Pine Valley 5 found after 17 years. People who had long stopped attending the vigils began showing up again, leaving flowers at the site. But with every new question answered, 2 more appeared. Why were only 3 of them in the truck? If it was a crash, where were the others? The sheriff assigned a new investigative team to re-examine the case. They used 3D mapping and terrain analysis to reconstruct the truck's trajectory. Based on the angle of descent, they estimated the vehicle hadn't rolled by accident. It appeared to have reversed slowly before accelerating. That single detail changed everything. If someone had been behind the wheel, why was the driver still buckled in? And if all 3 victims were restrained, who took the keys? The forensic pathologist's report added more unease. All 3 seatbelts were found latched, but the bones of the driver showed compression injuries inconsistent with a fall. It looked as though the body had been positioned after impact. No one could say why. The coroner called it anomalous. Privately, Investigators called it impossible. Ranger Lowe returned to the site days later, standing where she'd first spotted that glint of metal through the mud. The woods were silent except for the low hum of insects. In the distance, the reservoir shimmered beneath the trees. 17 years of silence had ended in that moment, but the echoes it unleashed were just beginning. For the first time since 2001, Pine Valley had evidence, physical proof that the friends had never left. But the discovery also reopened old fears. If the truck had been hidden all this time, buried and sealed by storms, how had no one ever found it sooner? And more importantly, if 3 of them were there, where were the other 2? Every case we tell takes weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. We do this because these stories matter and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going, and if you want to see more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you below. Now, let's get back to the case. Detective Mara Holloway had taken over the Pine Valley Cold Cases Division 2 years earlier, inheriting shelves of old files that smelled faintly of dust and despair. Most were unsolvable, the kind of cases that kept aging parents waiting for a phone call that never came. But there was one folder she kept apart from the others, its tab worn soft, its label handwritten in faded ink. Pine Valley 5. She'd grown up only 40 minutes from the town. She remembered the news footage from 2001, the faces of those kids smiling awkwardly in their senior photos. Everyone her age knew that story. When the remains of 3 of the friends were discovered in 2018, Mara found herself staring at that file again. Officially, the investigation was closed. 3 dead, 2 missing. But there were too many details that didn't fit: seatbelts latched, keys gone, phones unaccounted for. The reports gnawed at her. So she did what no one else had done in nearly 2 decades. She started from the beginning. Mara began by reconstructing the final night minute by minute, using cell tower data that had been archived since the early 2000s. The original detectives had mapped basic pings, but technology back then was primitive. New forensic software could now plot exact movement ranges, and what it revealed changed everything. All 5 phones had been active at 11:53 p.m., the estimated time of the crash. By midnight, 3 of them went offline. Evan's, Hannah's, and Travis's likely destroyed on impact. But 2 signals lingered. Melissa's and Jake's phones continued sending periodic pings for nearly 6 hours after the crash. The data placed them nearly half a mile north of the ravine, closer to the edge of the reservoir. That meant, at least for a while, 2 of them were still alive. It was an extraordinary discovery, but one that raised more questions than answers. If they survived, why didn't they make it out? And why had no one found a trace of them before now? Mara reopened the field investigation quietly, avoiding media attention. She brought in a small team, 2 deputies, and a forensic anthropologist from Lexington. Together, they retraced the path from the ravine toward the reservoir. The terrain was steep and overgrown, a labyrinth of fallen logs and sinkholes that could easily swallow evidence for decades. 3 days into the search, one of the dogs picked up a faint scent trail near the north ridge. The handler said it was weak, aged, but consistent with human decomposition. The dogs followed the scent for nearly a quarter mile before veering off toward a dense patch of undergrowth. That's where they found it. Beneath layers of brush and pine needles lay what appeared to be an old campsite. The remains of a fire pit sat in the center, filled with blackened stones and charred wood. Nearby, 2 distinct sets of footprints were preserved in the hardened soil, one smaller, one larger. A torn sleeping bag clung to a fallen branch, its fabric stiff and sun-bleached. For 17 years, it had been hidden in plain sight. Mara crouched beside the ashes, brushing aside dirt with gloved hands. Inside the pit, fragments of burned cloth and melted plastic still clung to the soil. Someone had been here long enough to build a fire. Someone had tried to survive. A few feet away, Deputy Graves called her over. Wedged beneath a flat rock near the tree line was a piece of folded paper, nearly fused to the ground by rain and time. They pried it loose carefully. When they unfolded it, the ink had faded, but the words were still legible enough to send chills down their spines. Went for help. Can hear them. Don't follow. The handwriting matched samples from Melissa Carter's school essays. For a long moment, no one spoke. The forest around them felt too still. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees broke the silence. Back at the lab, handwriting analysis confirmed what they already suspected. Melissa wrote that note. It had likely been left in haste, maybe weighted under the rock to prevent it from blowing away. But what struck Mara most wasn't the message itself, it was what it implied. Can hear them. Who was them? Search teams? Animals? Or something or someone else? The campsite and note changed everything. What had once been assumed an accident was now something more complicated. The official theory that all 5 friends had died instantly in the crash no longer held. 2 had clearly made it out alive, injured or disoriented, and had tried to find help. But the woods around Miller's Bluff were unforgiving. Temperatures dropped steeply at night. Visibility was near zero without light. If they were hurt and lost, it was easy to see how they might have succumbed to exposure. Yet, even that explanation didn't sit right. The area where the campsite was found had been searched multiple times during the original investigation. Drone scans, cadaver dogs, hikers, none of them reported anything. For that campsite to have gone undetected, it had to be hidden deliberately. As word of the discovery leaked, the small Kentucky town that had spent nearly 2 decades healing was ripped open again. Families who'd finally learned to live with their grief found themselves dragged back into the nightmare. Melissa's mother, Diane, told a reporter she couldn't stop replaying that note in her head. "She was my little girl," she said quietly. "If she was alive out there, even for a few hours, and no one found her, how do you live with that?" Jake's older brother, Matthew, reacted differently. He'd always believed the group stumbled onto something that night, something they weren't supposed to see. They didn't just crash, he told police. They ran. Detective Holloway didn't dismiss the idea outright. The terrain analysis of the site suggested the fire pit had been dug quickly, not for comfort but for warmth. The footprints were close together, indicating limited movement, like whoever made them had stayed low. Something had frightened them. And then, eventually, they left. Forensic teams sifted every inch of the area. They found a rusted pocket knife, a half-melted flashlight, and traces of denim fabric matching the jeans Melissa was last seen wearing. But no skeletal remains. No evidence of where they went after leaving. That note. Night after night, Mara sat at her desk, staring at the photographs pinned to her board, the crash site, the campsite, the note. The pieces were there, but they didn't fit. If Melissa and Jake had survived, why move toward the reservoir instead of the road? Why not try to climb back up toward the bluff, where lights from the valley could be seen? Unless they were running from something in the opposite direction. In early June, she brought in an environmental forensic expert to analyze soil and burn residue from the site. The report confirmed something unsettling. Traces of diesel fuel were found in the ashes. It was not consistent with the gasoline used in the Ford Ranger. Diesel burns longer and hotter, suggesting they'd used it deliberately, possibly scavenged from another source. But there had been no other vehicles. The finding deepened the mystery further. Someone or something else had been there after the crash. When Mara presented the results to the sheriff, he asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "You think they were alone out there?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because deep down, everyone in Pine Valley knew that if Melissa and Jake had survived that night, they hadn't just been lost. They'd been hiding. And whatever or whoever they were hiding from had found them first. The search that began as an act of closure soon became something much darker. After the discovery of the campsite and Melissa's note, the Kentucky State Police widened the search grid, pushing deeper into the northern ridge beyond Miller's Bluff. The area was remote and unforgiving, tangled brush, limestone drop-offs, and deer trails that twisted for miles without ever returning to the same place. But it was also the only direction the phone pings had ever pointed. If Melissa and Jake had left the campsite alive, this was where they would have gone. On the 3rd morning of the renewed search, one of the cadaver dogs broke away from its handler near a creek bed and began barking frantically toward a rise of trees. The air was cold and still, the kind of stillness that carries sound for miles. Investigators followed the noise up a steep incline until they reached a clearing barely visible from the trail. That's where they saw it, an old hunting cabin, half collapsed under years of rot and moss, its roof bowed in and walls leaning at crooked angles. It wasn't marked on any property record. No utilities, no access road. Just an aging structure hidden from sight unless you were standing almost on top of it. The kind of place people forget exists until it's too late. The dogs led them straight to the side of the cabin, where the soil had been disturbed. Two separate patches of earth sat under stones, deliberately placed but unmarked. The team froze. After 17 years of searching, after all the false leads and speculation, there was no mistaking what they'd found. Forensic crews arrived that afternoon and began carefully excavating the site. The first set of remains surfaced less than a foot below the surface, human bones, still partially wrapped in decayed cloth. A few feet away, another shallow grave. Two bodies, buried hastily, side by side. When they were finally lifted from the ground, the small personal details told the story that DNA would later confirm. A cracked locket with Melissa Carter's initials engraved on the back. The rubber sole of a hiking shoe that matched the pair Jake Myers had been wearing the night he disappeared. The discovery hit Pine Valley like a second storm. For the families, it was both a relief and a new kind of heartbreak. The search was over, but closure came with an unbearable weight. Melissa and Jake had survived the crash only to die in the woods within 48 hours. Autopsy results confirmed what no one wanted to hear. Neither of them had died from the fall or from injuries consistent with a vehicle accident. Melissa had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Jake's cause of death was a combination of exposure and blood loss from defensive wounds on his forearms. Both had died within 2 days of the crash together, not far from the reservoir where they had once built their final fire. The investigators combed every inch of the clearing, mapping the scene, cataloging fragments of debris left behind. Near the graves, they recovered a rusted rifle, an empty beer can wedged into the dirt, and an old military-style tarp, faded and stiff from weather. Burned into one corner of the tarp were the initials T.L. Travis Lorne. The finding sent a ripple of confusion through the department. Travis had already been confirmed as one of the 3 victims in the truck. His tarp shouldn't have been there. The working theory was that the group must have taken it from the bed of the truck before it went over the bluff, maybe to use as shelter. But that detail opened an even darker question. If Melissa and Jake were alive and in possession of Travis's tarp, had they gone back to the crash site? And if they did, had someone else been there waiting? Forensic testing ruled Travis out as the killer. His DNA was present, but only on the edges of the fabric consistent with ownership, not violence. However, what investigators did find on the tarp changed everything. Traces of another man's blood, older and degraded but still identifiable through modern DNA amplification techniques. It belonged to Arthur Kane. Kane's name hadn't been mentioned in the case for years, but in Pine Valley, everyone over 40 remembered him. He was the reclusive property owner whose land bordered Miller's Bluff back in 2001, a former hunter who lived alone in a cabin off the ridge, known for chasing off trespassers with a shotgun, and a reputation for being unpredictable. He vanished in the summer of 2002, less than a year after the teenagers disappeared. Back then, his disappearance had barely made the local paper. A missing recluse wasn't news in rural Kentucky. Detective Holloway dug through old archives and found that Kane had been questioned briefly during the initial investigation. At the time, he told police he'd heard an engine and a crash one night but didn't think much of it. He said he didn't go near the bluff and had nothing to do with the kids who went missing. The interview was brief, and with no evidence linking him, the sheriff let him go. Within a year, Kane himself was gone. The rifle found near the graves provided the first tangible link between him and the Pine Valley Five. Ballistic records confirmed it had been registered to Kane in 1996. His hunting license had expired the following year. When analysts tested the weapon, they found blood residue in the chamber and a partial fingerprint on the stock too degraded for a match, but the DNA confirmed Kane's. If Kane's blood was on the tarp and his rifle had been left at the scene, it painted a grim picture. Mara Holloway reconstructed what might have happened. The 5 friends, after their truck veered off the bluff, had wandered through the woods in the dark. Injured, panicked, and lost, they likely stumbled onto Kane's property, maybe looking for help. Somewhere near his cabin, an argument or misunderstanding escalated. A frightened old man with a gun, a group of desperate teenagers, confusion in the dark. Shots fired. The evidence suggested Kane had been wounded that night, his blood found on the tarp, possibly after being struck during a struggle. He might have fled or fallen. The surviving teens, terrified, used the tarp to cover themselves or tend to Jake's injuries, eventually retreating to the cabin where the graves were later found. But Kane, already injured and alone, may have tried to chase them or simply vanished into the woods. No record of him existed after that summer. Forensic specialists ran hydrological simulations of the ravine near the crash site and concluded that a body could have easily been swept into the reservoir after heavy rainfall and never recovered. The story was tragic enough to feel plausible, but there were still gaps, questions no one could fill. Who buried Melissa and Jake? Did one of them do it before dying? Or did Kane return after all? The graves were shallow, the kind of hurried burial done by someone without tools or time. Mara stood at the edge of the clearing that evening as crews finished their work. The cabin's walls had been torn open by rot, its windows long gone. She could still see faint markings scratched into the wood inside initials, tally marks, and on the doorframe, a faded warning carved in block letters, "Keep out." It wasn't clear if Kane had carved it years before, or if one of the kids had done it after realizing where they were. When the press broke the story, Pine Valley split again. Some said the kids were victims of a misunderstanding that turned violent. Others whispered about something more deliberate, that Kane hadn't just been paranoid, but dangerous, that he might have lured them in. But the evidence, as compelling as it was, didn't allow for certainty. The official conclusion described the tragedy as a sequence of accidental and human-driven events leading to fatal outcomes. Yet, there was one final detail that haunted Mara. The note Melissa left at the campsite: "Went for help. Can hear them. Don't follow. Now read differently." For years, people assumed "them" meant search teams or wild animals. But now, knowing Kane had lived nearby, it seemed more likely she had heard a man shouting in the woods, maybe calling for his dog or yelling in pain after being wounded. Maybe she thought it was danger approaching. The idea that she died running from someone who might have been trying to help was almost too much to bear. When the case file finally closed in late 2018, it ended with a single line: "Evidence suggests all parties perished within a 48-hour period between July 14 and the 16th of July, 2001. The deaths of Melissa Carter and Jake Myers are ruled accidental homicide resulting from blunt trauma and exposure." In Pine Valley, the families gathered once more at the Bluff. The sheriff's office placed 5 wooden crosses in a row, overlooking the valley where their children had last been seen alive. The wind that night was cold and sharp. 17 years of silence had finally broken, but what it revealed wasn't the peace anyone had hoped for. Because even with the truth uncovered, the question lingered in everyone's mind. In those final hours, in the dark silence of that cabin, what exactly had happened between a frightened recluse and 5 lost friends who only wanted to go home? By the fall of 2018, the investigation that had haunted Pine Valley for nearly 2 decades was finally reaching its end. The woods around Miller's Bluff were quiet again, just the sound of wind through the pines, the slow creak of branches, and the faint hum of insects that always seemed to return after tragedy had passed. For months, rangers and forensic teams had combed the area inch by inch, searching for anything that could complete the story. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a discovery was made that no one expected. It was one of the younger rangers who found it. He'd been re-clearing the original bonfire site to prepare it for permanent closure when his shovel hit something hard beneath the soil. At first, he thought it was just a buried stone, but when he dug deeper, he uncovered a small rusted tin box, sealed with layers of duct tape. The lid was dented, but intact. Inside were folded scraps of paper, an old disposable camera, and a few small trinkets. a bottle cap, a concert ticket, a silver bracelet with a broken clasp. When investigators reviewed the contents, they realized what it was: a time capsule, buried by the 5 friends weeks before the night they vanished. Each of them had written a letter to their future selves. The handwriting was smudged, some of the paper torn and water-stained, but the words were still legible. The letters were simple, filled with the kind of teenage optimism that feels invincible. Evan wrote about wanting to move to Nashville and start a band. Hannah dreamed of becoming a nurse, the kind that makes people feel safe again. Jake wrote about adventure, about leaving town, seeing mountains, living a life bigger than Pine Valley. Travis's note was only a few sentences long, a quiet promise that they'd come back every year, same spot, same friends. And Melissa's letter ended with a line that broke everyone who read it. "No matter where we go, this place will always be ours." The box became the emotional heart of the entire case. For all the theories, the rumors, and the forensic reports, this was the first thing they'd ever found that spoke directly from the voices lost in those woods. It wasn't evidence, it was memory. And somehow, it made the tragedy feel both heavier and more human. The official forensic report released later that winter closed every loop investigators could trace. The sequence of events was finally clear. The group had gathered at Miller's Bluff that July night, just like they had done every summer. Sometime after midnight, their truck rolled backward off the edge, crashing 30 feet into the ravine below. 3 of them, Evan, Hannah, and Travis, were killed instantly. Melissa and Jake, disoriented but alive, escaped through the shattered window, grabbed what supplies they could from the bed of the truck, and fled into the woods. They stumbled through the darkness, eventually reaching Kane's property. The forensic analysis confirmed that an altercation occurred near the cabin. Kane's blood on the tarp proved he had been injured that night, likely struck by Jake in a desperate attempt to defend himself. Kane's rifle was discharged, though there was no evidence he had hit anyone before succumbing to his wound. The chaos that followed left Melissa and Jake stranded, terrified, and exposed to the elements. They tried to survive near the cabin, using the tarp for warmth, the rifle for protection. When they finally decided to search for help, they never made it far. By all accounts, the case was over. 17 years of unanswered questions, dead ends, and grief had been distilled into one grim, logical explanation. A chain of accidents, panic, and bad luck that spiraled into tragedy. The official conclusion listed the deaths as accidental, caused by environmental exposure and injuries sustained during an altercation. No foul play, no cover-up, just the quiet cruelty of circumstance. But for the families, closure didn't come easily. On a cold morning in December, they gathered once more at Miller's Bluff for a final memorial. Wooden crosses now stood where the fire had once burned, each marked with a name and a small photograph. The sheriff's department, the ranger service, and a handful of locals joined them. Someone brought flowers, someone else lit candles. And for the first time in 17 years, there was silence instead of speculation. Melissa's mother stood near the edge of the bluff, staring down into the ravine where the truck had been found. She didn't say much, just whispered that maybe, after all this time, the kids had finally come home. Evan's father laid his son's guitar pick at the base of the cross, the same one Evan used to keep in his pocket during those summer nights. Detective Mara Holloway watched from a distance. For her, the case had never been about headlines or answers, it had been about restoring something the town had lost a long time ago. Truth. But even as she stood there, she couldn't shake one detail that still haunted her: the photograph recovered years earlier from Melissa's burned cell phone. The one that showed the bonfire, the blurred outlines of 3 friends, and 2 points of light glowing in the background. For nearly 2 decades, people had believed those lights were another vehicle, a sign that someone else had been there that night. But the final forensic review proved otherwise. The reflection matched the angle of the Ford Ranger's taillights as it tilted backward, moments before it went over the edge. Those lights weren't from another car. They were from their own. A mirror image of fate, caught in a flash before everything went dark. In the end, it wasn't malice or mystery that took them, it was fear, confusion, and the vast indifference of the woods they'd thought they knew so well. Later that evening, As the families left the bluff, the ranger who'd found the time capsule stayed behind to collect the candles. He noticed the way the air cooled as the sun dipped behind the ridge, how quickly the forest swallowed the last of the light. Before leaving, he paused beside Melissa's cross and looked out over the valley. Down below, the reservoir shimmered faintly in the fading light, quiet and still. Somewhere beneath that water lay fragments of metal, pieces of glass, and the echo of a night no one in Pine Valley would ever forget. The final report was signed, sealed, and filed away. But one line remained in the minds of everyone who had ever touched the case, a sentence written on crumpled paper, found under a stone, by a girl who had tried to save herself and her friend. Went for help, can hear them, don't follow. It became more than a clue. It became her voice frozen in time, echoing through 17 years of silence. And even now, when the wind moves through the trees above Miller's Bluff, some say it still carries that same faint warning, not as a mystery anymore, but as a memory of what was left behind,